The Voranth salvage vessel Ashcutter found the wreck of the TCS Last Word drifting in the debris field of the Kelser Expanse 4 months after the battle that had, by every account in the Voranth Imperium's official record, destroyed it entirely, and salvage master Thren Corvallis considered the discovery, at first glance, an almost insultingly modest prize for the 6-week patrol circuit that had finally brought her crew this deep into contested space. The hull hung dead in the dark, scored along its length with the scorched, pitted evidence of the engagement that had crippled it, its running lights dark, its weapons batteries cold, its reactor signature so faint against the background radiation of the debris field that her own scanning officer had nearly missed it entirely on the first pass. Terran heavy cruiser, her scanning officer reported, running a second, more thorough sweep as the Ashcutter closed the distance. Matches the profile of the task force we hit at Kelser back in the spring campaign. Command listed this hull as destroyed in the after-action report, but I'm reading enough structural integrity to suggest it survived the engagement, at least in the sense of not actually breaking apart. No power signature beyond passive reactor bleed. No life support readings anywhere aboard. No response to hailing on any frequency. A derelict, then, Thren said, feeling the particular flat disappointment of a salvage officer whose crew had spent 6 weeks hoping for something considerably more valuable than a burned-out hulk too badly damaged to be worth towing back for resale. 4 months adrift with no crew intervention to keep even minimal systems running. Whatever remained of her crew either evacuated before we caught up with the wreck, or didn't survive long enough afterward to matter. Bring us alongside. I want a boarding team through her hull within the hour. Even a dead Terran cruiser might carry salvageable weapons technology and intelligence data worth the detour, and we've come too far this patrol cycle to leave without something to show for it. She did not know, giving that order with the casual, unhurried confidence of an officer who had cracked open dozens of genuine derelicts across a long salvage career, that the ship drifting silent and lightless in front of her had not, in fact, gone dark through any failure of its remaining crew's discipline, but through the deliberate, meticulously maintained deception of a captain who had spent 4 months keeping every one of her ship's true signatures buried beneath exactly the kind of passive, lifeless profile a hostile patrol's scanners would read as confirmation that nothing worth stopping for remained aboard at all. Commander Iris Quan had commanded the TCS Last Word for 3 years before the engagement at Kelser Expanse tore the heart out of her task force and left her own ship crippled deep inside Voranth-controlled space. And she remembered, with a clarity that had not dulled in the 4 months since, the exact moment she'd made the decision that had kept the 61 surviving members of her crew alive ever since. The task force's flagship had gone up in a single catastrophic detonation 20 minutes into the ambush, and the 2 escort frigates accompanying the Last Word had followed within the hour, leaving her own ship, its reactor damaged, its weapons offline, its hull venting atmosphere from a dozen breaches, as the last visible target for a Voranth strike group that showed every sign of finishing what the ambush had started. She had given the order to fake the ship's death with less than 4 minutes remaining before the Voranth strike group's final approach, venting the last of her ship's excess reactor heat through a decoy thermal channel her engineering officer, improvised in the desperate scramble of those final minutes, cutting every system not essential to bare survival, and ordering the 61 crew members she had left to abandon every station not required to maintain the illusion and retreat into the ship's most heavily shielded compartments, where their own life signs would register, to any but the most exhaustive scan, as nothing more than background radiation noise against the wreck's own scorched, chaotic energy signature. It had worked, in the desperate, immediate sense that mattered most in that first terrifying hour. The Voranth Strike Group's final pass had registered the last word as a confirmed kill, logged it in their own after-action reports, and moved on to pursue whatever remained of the shattered task force elsewhere in the system, leaving Iris Kwan and her surviving crew adrift, badly wounded, deep inside enemy territory, with no functioning long-range communications, no working propulsion beyond the barest maneuvering thrusters, and no realistic prospect of rescue arriving before their supplies ran out entirely. They had survived the 4 months since through a discipline that Iris found, even now, ain'tly astonishing to have actually sustained, rationing, rotating skeleton watches to conserve life support, running the ship's systems at a bare fraction of normal power draw, and maintaining, above every other priority, the same careful, meticulous illusion of total lifelessness that had saved them in that first desperate hour. Because both Iris and every member of her surviving crew understood, without needing it said aloud, that the illusion's collapse at any point in the months since would have brought exactly the kind of finishing strike the original ambush had failed to deliver. The watch rotation that had kept the last word's illusion intact for 4 months divided the surviving crew into 3 groups, a structure Iris and her senior staff had settled on within the first week of their isolation after several difficult, exhausting debates about how best to balance the ship's limited life support capacity against the very real danger of losing vigilance at exactly the wrong moment. A third of the crew remained in an induced low metabolism sleep at any given time, packed into the ship's most heavily shielded compartment on a rotating cycle that let their bodies' reduced oxygen and caloric needs stretch the ship's dwindling supplies considerably further than 61 people, maintaining full waking activity, ever could have managed. A second third rested in a lighter, more easily interrupted rest cycle, available within minutes if the ship's passive sensors detected anything requiring an immediate response. And a final third remained fully awake at all times, standing the kind of quiet, unglamorous watch that had, across 4 months of otherwise unbroken silence, kept the ship's careful deception from ever slipping even once. It was Lieutenant Commander Ravi Desmukh, the last word's senior tactical officer, and the man who had stood more hours of that exhausting, uneventful watch than any other member of the crew besides Iris herself, who first flagged the Ashcutter's approach on the ship's passive sensor array, a system so heavily throttled to avoid emitting any detectable signature of its own that its detection range had shrunk, across 4 months of careful power conservation, to barely a fraction of its original capacity. "Contact," he said, keeping his voice at the low, careful register the entire crew had long since learned to default to, even in compartments where an enemy's own sensors could not possibly have picked up ordinary conversation. Voranth's signature, moving slow, running an active scan pattern. This isn't a patrol on routine transit, Commander. They've found us, and they're closing to investigate. Iris felt the particular, familiar cold settle into her chest that had greeted every previous close pass of a Voranth vessel across the preceding 4 months, a fear that had never fully dulled with repetition, no matter how many times the illusion had held. "Confirm they haven't picked up anything beyond the passive wreck signature," she said. "If they're running a standard salvage assessment scan rather than a dedicated life sign sweep, we may still hold." Ravi worked his console for several tense minutes, cross-referencing the approaching vessel's scan pattern against every intelligence report the last word's own archives held on Voranth's salvage doctrine. And when he finally looked up, his expression carried a weight that told Iris, before he spoke a single word, that this particular close pass was not going to resolve itself the same quiet, uneventful way the handful of previous near misses had. "They're not just scanning, Commander," he said. "They're closing for a boarding approach. I count a docking shuttle already prepping for launch from their forward bay. Whatever they think they're finding aboard this ship, they intend to come aboard and take it." Iris gathered her senior staff in the cramped auxiliary command center the crew had been using for 4 months in place of the last word's main bridge, which sat too close to the hull's most visibly damaged section to risk occupying, and laid out the situation with the same flat, unhurried clarity she'd learned, across a long career, was the only way to keep a frightened crew thinking clearly rather than panicking. "We cannot outrun them," she said. "Our propulsion is barely sufficient for station keeping, let alone evasion, and even if it were, running would confirm to their entire strike group exactly what we've spent 4 months convincing them we aren't. We cannot outgun them either. Our weapons batteries have been offline since the original engagement, and bringing them back online in the time we have available isn't remotely realistic. What we can do is use the one advantage 4 months of careful, patient survival has actually given us that this boarding party cannot possibly anticipate. We know every corridor, every access point, and every dead space in this ship considerably better than any salvage crew cracking us open for tea. He first time ever will, and we have 61 people who have spent 4 months training, in the quiet hours between watch shifts, for exactly the contingency we're now facing." Ravi Desmukh, who had led that quiet training himself across the preceding weeks, more out of a need to keep the crew's morale and discipline intact than any genuine expectation they would ever need to use it, felt something settle into place in his own chest that was not quite relief but ran adjacent to it. "We've drilled the boarding response a dozen times, Commander. Every crew member knows their fallback position, their engagement zone, and their signal to move. If the Voranth boarding party comes through the same maintenance access most salvage crews favor for an initial breach, we can funnel them into the mid-deck corridor, where we hold every tactical advantage their own numbers can't easily overcome in that confined a space." "Then that's our plan," Iris said. "We let them believe exactly what they've come here to confirm, a dead ship, an easy salvage job, nothing waiting for them but wreckage and whatever intelligence data they think they're about to strip from our systems. We give them every reason to move through this ship with the same careless confidence that's gotten more than one overconfident boarding party killed against considerably weaker targets than a warship's own surviving crew defending its home corridors. And when they've committed fully enough that turning back costs them more than pressing forward, we remind them exactly why the Terran Navy doesn't build ships that die quietly, even when every sensor reading says otherwise. She looked around the small, crowded command center at the exhausted, hollow-eyed faces of officers who had spent 4 months holding a discipline that had asked more of them than any training exercise had ever prepared them for, and found, in the sudden, focused readiness that settled over the room at her words, the same quiet, unbreakable resolve that had kept all 61 of them alive through every one of the preceding 4 months' worst moments. "Positions, everyone," she said. "Let's show them exactly how badly they've misjudged this wreck." The Voranth boarding team cut through the last word's outer hull at the same maintenance access point Ravi Desmuk had predicted. 6 armored figures moving into the ship's dark, cold interior with the unhurried confidence of a crew that had performed this exact procedure on dozens of genuine derelicts before, and saw no particular reason to expect this wreck would prove any different. Their leader, a broad, scarred veteran named Boarding Chief Karis Vel, swept his suit lights across corridors coated in 4 months of undisturbed dust and drifting debris, and allowed himself the same faint, satisfied assessment every experienced salvager eventually developed for a genuinely dead ship. "Standard derelict signature," he reported back to the ash cutter. "No power beyond passive systems, no movement, no resistance. This is a clean job. We'll want full data extraction from whatever's left of their tactical systems before we start stripping components. Salvage master Corvallis will want the intelligence value logged before we touch anything else." He did not know, moving deeper into the ship with his team spread in a standard search formation, that every corridor he passed through had been deliberately left in exactly the state of undisturbed, neglect his own instincts read as confirmation of the ship's death. While 61 crew members watched his team's progress through a network of maintenance access panels and ventilation grates that gave the last word's own people a considerably clearer picture of the boarding party's position than the boarding party had of theirs. Iris Quan watched Karis Vel's team advance toward the mid-deck corridor through a small monitor fed by a hidden camera her engineering officer had rigged during the crew's weeks of quiet preparation, and felt the particular, focused calm that had carried her through every crisis of her command settle over her now, displacing the raw fear that had gripped her chest at the first sign of the ash cutter's approach. "They're entering the funnel corridor," she said, over the crew's tightly encrypted short-range comm channel. "All positions hold until my signal. Let them commit fully before we move." The boarding team advanced into the mid-deck corridor exactly as Ravi Desmuk's plan had anticipated, drawn by the deliberately arranged appearance of a partially accessible data terminal that Iris's engineering staff had rigged, in the preceding hours, to look like precisely the kind of easy intelligence prize a salvage team would want to secure before anything else. Carswell's team spread out along the corridor's length, weapons lowered in the casual posture of soldiers who had long since stopped expecting genuine resistance from a target their own scans confirmed was empty, and it was in the exact moment his lead technician reached for the rigged terminal that the corridor's lights, dead for 4 months, flared to sudden, blinding life around them. "Now," Iris said, and 61 crew members who had spent 4 months surviving on nothing but discipline and the stubborn refusal to simply accept the death their enemy had already logged in an official record somewhere, moved as one out of the ship's hidden access points, and reminded a badly startled Voranth boarding team exactly how much danger could still be found aboard a warship. The wider galaxy had already written off as nothing more than an empty, forgotten wreck. Carswell's team, caught in the sudden glare of lights and the equally sudden appearance of armed figures emerging from what their own scans had insisted was an empty ship, reacted with the disoriented, half-second delay of soldiers whose entire operational assumption had just been violently upended. And it was precisely that half-second, exploited by a crew who had drilled this exact contingency more times than any of them could easily count, that decided the engagement's outcome before it had properly begun. Ravi Desmuk's own position, covering the corridor's forward choke point, dropped the boarding team's lead technician with a precise, non-lethal strike before the man had fully processed what was happening, while 2 more crew members closed on the flanking positions Iris's plan had assigned them, disarming rather than killing wherever the engagement's chaotic first seconds allowed for the choice. Carswell himself, considerably more experienced than his younger subordinates and considerably faster to recover from the engagement's opening shock, managed to bring his own weapon to bear before Iris closed the final distance between them, and the two of them grappled in the corridor's narrow confines with an intensity that spoke, on both sides, of soldiers who understood exactly how much rode on the engagement's outcome. "You're supposed to be dead," Vel said, forcing the words out through the effort of the struggle, genuine disbelief cutting through his professional training. "Every scan, every report. We're rather more difficult to finish off than your reports gave us credit for," Iris said, and ended the exchange with a maneuver that put him, disarmed and pinned, against the same corridor while his own boarding team had swept past minutes earlier with such careless confidence. "I'd suggest you order what's left of your team to stand down, boarding chief. We've no particular wish to make this any bloodier than it's already become, but I promise you we're considerably better prepared to finish it than you were to start it." The engagement's remaining moments unfolded quickly after that. The Voranth boarding team's initial numerical parity with Iris's chosen ambush positions collapsing entirely once the shock of the reversal fully registered. And within minutes the corridor held 6 disarmed, thoroughly startled Voranth salvage crew members, and 61 Terran sailors who had just proven, decisively, and at remarkably little cost to themselves, that the wreck their enemy had spent 4 months believing dead still carried every bit of the fight its crew had ever possessed. "Casualties?" Iris asked, once the immediate danger had passed, her voice carrying the particular controlled urgency of a commander who had spent 4 months dreading exactly the kind of loss this engagement might have cost her crew. None on our side, Commander, Ravi reported, no small measure of relief cutting through his own professional composure. A few bruises and one dislocated shoulder from the initial grapple, nothing our medical staff can't handle. Their side took rather worse, but nothing beyond what standard first aid should manage, assuming we choose to extend it. We extend it, Iris said, without hesitation. Whatever else this crew has had to become across the last 4 months to survive, we haven't become the kind of people who let a defeated, disarmed enemy suffer unnecessarily. See to their wounded, and then let's discuss, boarding Chief Vel, exactly how this rather significant change in your circumstances is going to help solve the rather significant problem my own crew has been facing for considerably longer than your unfortunate salvage run. Boarding Chief Karis Vel, seated under guard in what remained of the last word's small medical bay, while his own dislocated fingers were set by a Terran corpsman working with the same brisk, professional care she'd have shown any of her own crew, found himself facing a proposition from Commander Quan that struck him. Once the initial shock of his capture had settled into something closer to grudging professional respect, as considerably more reasonable than he'd expected from a crew that had, by any measure, every right to treat him with rather less consideration than they'd actually extended. I'm not interested in your ship as a prize boarding chief, Iris told him, and I've no particular wish to hold you or your team as prisoners any longer than circumstances require. What I need is considerably simpler: fuel, spare components for our propulsion systems, and enough of a head start before your salvage master grows concerned about your team's silence to make a clean break from this system possible. I'd ask you to consider, given everything your own team just experienced, that cooperating with that request costs you rather less than continuing to underestimate exactly what this crew is still capable of. Vel considered the proposition for a long moment, weighing, with the particular calculation of a man whose career had taught him a great deal about recognizing a genuinely lost position, the very limited options his current circumstances actually offered him. The ash cutter carries considerably more fuel reserve than a single crippled cruiser like yours would need, he said finally. And Salvage Master Corvallis isn't going to grow concerned about our silence for at least another 2 hours. Standard boarding assessments on a confirmed derelict of this size typically run that long, and she won't break protocol to check in early unless something gives her specific reason to. He paused, studying Iris with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the preceding minutes, from professional hostility into something closer to reluctant curiosity. I confess I'd rather like to understand how a ship logged as destroyed managed to survive 4 months in the heart of contested space, without a single one of our patrol sweeps catching so much as a hint of it. Discipline, Iris said simply, and 61 people who refused to accept that a bad day meant the end of the story. I'd imagine your own service teaches something similar, boarding chief, whatever differences otherwise separate our two governments. The plan that followed, worked out across the following 90 minutes with a mixture of Terran ingenuity and somewhat to Iris's own private surprise, genuine, if grudging, cooperation from Karis Vel's team, involved a considerably more ambitious solution than the simple resupply Iris had originally proposed. Rather than merely stripping the boarding shuttle of its fuel reserves and spare components before releasing Vel's team back to the ash cutter, Ravi Desmukh proposed a bolder alternative. Using the captured shuttle's own transponder codes and Vel's own authenticated credentials to approach the ash cutter directly, under the cover of a routine status report, and seize the considerably larger vessel outright, along with its full fuel reserves and functioning long-range communications array. Resources that would transform the Last Word's prospects from a desperate, uncertain limp toward friendly space into a genuine, well-supplied escape. It's an enormous risk, Ravi acknowledged, laying the plan out for Iris and her senior staff. If Corvallis grows suspicious of anything in the shuttle's return approach, we lose the element of surprise entirely, and we'll have expended resources and personnel we can't easily recover from a failed attempt. But if it works, Commander, we don't just escape this system. We escape it with a fully fueled, fully armed Voranth patrol vessel, and considerably better odds of making it home than any version of this plan that leaves the ash cutter behind to alert every other patrol in the sector the moment Vel's team fails to check in on schedule. Iris looked at Karis Vel, who had listened to the entire proposal with an expression that suggested he'd already anticipated exactly this escalation, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, extending a request she would never have imagined herself making of an enemy officer 4 months earlier. "I'd rather not force your cooperation on this next part, boarding chief," she said. "What happened in that corridor was decided by circumstance and your own team's overconfidence. What comes next is going to require your active, willing participation to have any real chance of success, and I've no interest in staking 61 lives on the cooperation of a man who might sabotage the plan the moment he sees an opening. So I'll ask you plainly, will you help us take the ash cutter? Or do we need to find a considerably more difficult way to secure this crew's escape?" Karis Vel was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the particular weight of a man weighing loyalties he had never expected to find himself questioning at all. "I've served the Imperium's salvage fleet for 11 years, he said finally. "I've cracked open more dead ships than I can easily count, and I've never once, in all that time, encountered a crew willing to extend an enemy the kind of consideration your people just showed mine, when every incentive your own survival created would have justified treating us considerably worse. I don't know what that says about your species, Commander Quan, beyond the fact that it's rather more than our own intelligence briefings ever prepared me to expect. I'll help you take the ash cutter, not because I've suddenly abandoned my own service, but because I find I'd rather be remembered as the officer who helped a genuinely remarkable crew survive an impossible situation than as one more casualty in whatever considerably bloodier outcome my refusal would have forced you toward instead." The plan executed 3 hours later, timed to fall within the standard reporting window. Vel's team's absence would otherwise begin to raise concern, and unfolded with a tension that Iris found, even after everything the preceding 4 months had already asked of her, among the most difficult of her entire command. Vel piloted the returning shuttle himself, his own authenticated credentials and the shuttle's genuine transponder codes carrying the small craft back toward the ash cutter, without triggering any of the security protocols a fabricated approach might have risked, while a small, carefully selected team of Terran sailors, disguised in salvaged Voranth boarding gear stripped from Vel's own unconscious subordinates, rode concealed within the shuttle's cargo hold. Salvage Master Thren Corvallis received the shuttle's return with nothing more than the ordinary, unremarkable attention of an officer, expecting a routine status update on an uneventful salvage operation. And it was not until Vel himself stepped through the ash cutter's docking bay, his own expression carrying a strain he could not entirely disguise, that the first thread of genuine alarm began to register in her own assessment of the returning boarding party. "Report," she said, studying him with the particular scrutiny of a commander whose long career had taught her to notice small inconsistencies in a subordinate's bearing. "You're behind schedule, boarding chief, and you look considerably less pleased with a clean salvage job than I'd expect." "The wreck presented some unexpected complications," Vel said, choosing his words with the same care Iris had trusted him to exercise, buying the final seconds the concealed Terran team needed to move into position throughout the docking bay's edges. "I'd recommend you review the full report personally, Salvage Master, rather than relying on my summary. Some of what we found aboard that ship isn't going to fit comfortably into a standard salvage assessment." It was in the moment Thren Corvallis stepped forward to press him for a clearer answer, her own instincts finally catching up to the wrongness she'd been sensing without quite naming, that the concealed Terran team emerged from the shuttle's cargo hold and the docking bay's edges, weapons raised, and Iris Quan herself, having insisted on leading this final, most dangerous phase of the operation personally, stepped forward to address the ash cutter's stunned commander directly. "Salvage Master Corvallis," she said, "I'm Commander Iris Quan of the Terran Confederated ship Last Word, the wreck your boarding team investigated several hours ago. I'd like to inform you that the wreck in question is considerably less dead than your own reports have logged it, and that your ship, as of this moment, is under new management. I've no particular wish to make this any more difficult than it needs to be. I'd ask you to order your crew to stand down, and I promise you every one of them will be treated with exactly the same consideration your own boarding chief received aboard my ship several hours ago." Thren Corvallis stood in stunned silence for a long moment, her gaze moving between the armed Terran sailors now holding position throughout her own ship's docking bay, and Karis Vel's carefully neutral expression, piecing together, with the particular speed of an experienced officer forced to recalculate an entire situation in real time, exactly how badly her own confident assessment of a simple salvage operation had misjudged the wreck her crew had spent the last several hours cracking open. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, echoing without knowing it, the same disbelieving words her own boarding chief had offered Iris Quan several hours earlier in a very different corridor. "I've heard that sentiment rather a lot today," Iris said. "I'd ask you to consider, Salvage Master, exactly how confident your own crew's continued safety currently rests on a decision you're about to make. My people have shown considerable restraint toward every one of your crew we've encountered so far, and I genuinely prefer that restraint continue uninterrupted. But I promise you, we did not survive 4 months in the heart of contested space through anything less than complete willingness to do whatever this crew's survival actually requires. And I'd rather not discover, this late in an already difficult day, exactly how far that willingness extends if you force the question. Corvallis's own calculation, weighing the numbers lie arrayed against her, 61 battle-hardened Terran sailors who had, by every account her own stunned boarding chief could offer, survived 4 months of undetected concealment through nothing but discipline and resourcefulness, against a salvage crew equipped and trained for the considerably gentler work of stripping already dead ships rather than fighting genuinely determined opposition. Reached its conclusion within seconds, rather than the extended deliberation the moment's wait might otherwise have demanded. "Stand down," she said, addressing her own crew over the Ashcutter's internal comm with a flatness that betrayed, to anyone listening closely, the particular strain of an officer accepting a defeat she had never once anticipated needing to consider. "All hands, weapons cold, cooperate fully with the boarding party. This is not a fight we are positioned to win, and I'll not spend a single one of your lives proving otherwise." The Ashcutter changed hands within the hour, its own crew of 43 secured without a single further casualty on either side, and Iris Quan found herself standing on the bridge of a fully functional, fully fueled enemy warship, considerably more capable than her own crippled cruiser had been even before the engagement at Kelser Expanse first stranded them, experiencing a relief so profound it left her, for one brief, unguarded moment, unable to fully process the scale of what her crew had just accomplished. The question of what to do with the Ashcutter's captured crew occupied a considerable portion of Iris's attention in the hours immediately following the ship's seizure, weighed against the more urgent priority of putting as much distance as possible between her crew's current position and whatever search effort the Voranth Imperium would eventually mount once Thren Corvallis's own silence began raising alarm through her chain of command. She settled, after consultation with her senior staff, and a rather more candid conversation with Karis Vel than either of them had expected to have, on a solution that balanced her crew's genuine need for security against a restraint she found herself, even now, unwilling to fully abandon. "We'll transfer your crew back aboard the Last Word," she told Corvallis, "along with sufficient supplies to sustain all of you comfortably until a Voranth patrol locates the wreck, which I expect will happen considerably faster now that the Last Word is broadcasting an active distress beacon, rather than maintaining the silence that's kept it hidden for the last 4 months. I'd ask that you hold your report of what actually happened here for as long as your own conscience allows, though I recognize that request asks rather more of you than any hostile powers officer should reasonably expect from a defeated enemy. Beyond that, I've no further claim on your crew's liberty or safety. You've been treated, throughout this entire encounter, with exactly the consideration I'd hope any crew in your position would extend to mine, were our positions somehow reversed." Karis Vel, standing nearby as the transfer was arranged, found himself offering an observation that carried, in its own quiet way, considerably more weight than the moment's practical arrangement strictly required. "For what it's worth, Commander Quan, I don't believe my report is going to do my Imperium, I should say, any particular favors, whatever version of events I eventually deliver. A crew capable of surviving 4 months undetected in the heart of contested space, and then capturing a fully crewed patrol vessel with a plan built around nothing more than discipline, patience, and the willingness to extend genuine mercy to a defeated enemy, is not a story any sensible intelligence service wants widely circulated among its own border patrol crews. I suspect, whatever I ultimately choose to report, that this Imperium's own command is going to find the true account of today's events rather more unsettling than any embellishment I might otherwise be tempted to add. That's rather the least of my concerns today, Boarding Chief," Iris said, extending a hand he accepted with a firmness that surprised them both. "I hope your own career survives the reporting rather better than your salvage operation did. For what it's worth, I meant what I said about your crew's conduct. You made a difficult situation considerably less bloody than it might have been, and I won't forget that, whatever comes of the rest of this war between our two governments." The journey back toward Terran-controlled space, undertaken aboard the captured ash cutter under the cover of its own legitimate transponder codes, and Iris's careful, methodical planning of a route that avoided every major Voranth patrol corridor her crew's 4 months of passive intelligence gathering had managed to map, consumed 11 tense days that Iris found, even measured against the preceding 4 months of desperate serve. Evil among the most nerve-wracking of her entire career. Every routine hail from a passing Voranth vessel carried the possibility that some detail of the ash cutter's altered crew roster or unfamiliar operational rhythm might trigger the kind of closer scrutiny her carefully maintained cover could not survive. And Iris found herself, more than once during those 11 days, holding a breath she did not fully release until the hailing vessel's own scan cleared them and moved on without further incident. The closest call came on the 9th day, when a Voranth border patrol frigate, running a routine security sweep of the exact transit corridor Iris's route had needed to cross, hailed the ash cutter directly and requested a status update consistent with the vessel's official salvage patrol designation. Iris, seated in the command chair that had, 11 days earlier, belonged to Thren Corvallis, found herself delivering a response built from the careful debriefing she'd extracted from Karis Vel during the crew's brief time together, adopting the clipped, procedural cadence of Voranth military communication with a precision that surprised even her own crew, several of whom had spent considerable effort helping her rehearse exactly this scenario during the preceding day's quieter hours. Ash cutter reporting routine salvage patrol, Kelser Expanse sector, returning to base with minor equipment damage requiring drydock repair, she said, into a channel she'd insisted on handling personally rather than delegating to any crew member less practiced in the deception. "Nothing requiring further assistance, but I'd appreciate an expedited clearance through this corridor if your own patrol schedule permits it. My engineering officer is rather anxious about a coolant leak that's been giving us trouble since the Kelser operation." the patrol frigate's own commanding officer, entirely unaware that he was speaking with the captain of a Terran warship his own government had logged as destroyed 4 months earlier, granted the requested clearance without further question, and Iris found herself, once the channel closed and the frigate's own signature finally cleared her sensor range, gripping the arms of her command chair with a tightness that left her hands aching for the better part of an hour afterward. The 11th day brought them, at last, across the border into contested space genuinely patrolled by Terran forces, and it was there, encountering a Terran border cruiser running its own routine security sweep, that Iris Kwan finally allowed herself the full, unguarded relief she had held carefully in check across 11 days of enemy territory and 4 months of desperate survival before that. The Terran border cruiser, a modest patrol vessel called the TCS Windrider, under the command of a considerably startled lieutenant commander named Petra Vosloo, received the Ashcutter's hailing signal with the immediate, reflexive alarm any Terran crew would extend to an unexpected Voranth vessel, appearing along a contested border corridor, weapons powering to combat readiness before Iris's own transmission had finished its opening seconds. Windrider, this is Commander Iris Kwan of the Terran Confederated ship Last Word, currently aboard a captured Voranth patrol vessel, Iris said, keeping her voice as steady as 4 months and 11 days of accumulated exhaustion allowed. I recognize how this hail must appear, and I'd ask you to hold fire long enough to verify my identity against Terran Navy records before drawing any further conclusions. My ship was logged as destroyed at the Kelser Expanse engagement 4 months ago. I promise you, that report was considerably premature. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Iris found herself, despite everything her crew had already survived, genuinely uncertain whether Petra Vosloo's own instincts would extend her transmission the benefit of the doubt its extraordinary claims plainly required. And it was not until a considerably more senior voice broke into the channel, cutting through Vosloo's own cautious hesitation, that Iris finally allowed herself to believe the ordeal was actually, genuinely nearing its end. Iris Kwan, is that actually you? The voice belonged to Rear Admiral Corwin Blackwood, Vosloo's own squadron commander, and as it happened, an officer who had served alongside Iris Kwan for over a decade before his own promotion had carried him toward flag rank, monitoring the border sector's communications from his own flagship several systems away, and patched into the exchange the moment Vosloo's alert reached his own command. "It's me, Corwin," Iris said, and found, for the first time in 4 months, that her own carefully maintained composure finally cracked, just slightly, around the edges of a voice that carried considerably more emotion than her command role had permitted her to show her own crew across the preceding ordeal. 61 survivors, myself I included. We've been running dark in Voranth space since Kelser. I'd very much appreciate an escort home if your squadron can spare one. Every ship in this squadron will escort you home personally if that's what it takes, Corwin said, and Iris could hear, even through the channel's imperfect audio, the particular thickness of a man fighting to keep his own voice as composed as the moment's professional formality demanded. Iris, we held a memorial for your entire crew 3 months ago. I gave the eulogy myself. I don't think I've ever been quite so glad to have been proven catastrophically wrong about anything in my entire career. The Last Word's crew received a hero's welcome upon their formal return to Terran space, a reception that Iris found, in the disorienting days that followed their rescue, considerably more overwhelming than the 4 months of quiet, desperate survival that had actually earned it. Families who had spent 3 months believing their sailors dead, who had attended memorial services and begun the slow, painful process of grieving losses that had never actually occurred, found themselves instead receiving the almost impossible news that their loved ones had survived, and the reunions that followed, held across a dozen different stations and colonies, as the crews, various families arrived to meet ships still completing their formal debriefing, carried an emotional weight that even Terran Naval Command's own carefully organized reception protocols struggled to fully accommodate. Rear Admiral Corwin Blackwood, presiding over the formal debriefing that occupied the better part of a week following the crew's return, found himself, more than once during that process, setting aside the standard procedural language his role generally demanded in favor of something closer to genuine, unguarded admiration for exactly what his old friend and her crew had actually accomplished. "I want it on the record," he told the assembled board of review, once Iris's own detailed account of the preceding 4 months had concluded, that this Navy's own after-action assessment of the Kelser engagement logged the Last Word as a total loss based on the most thorough sensor analysis our own intelligence services could conduct at the time. Commander Kwan and her crew did not merely survive an engagement this Navy believed had killed them. They survived it, maintained a discipline across 4 months that I do not believe this board can adequately measure through any standard commendation criteria currently on file, and then executed a boarding action and subsequent vessel capture against a fully crewed enemy patrol ship, using nothing but improvised tactics, careful planning, and the kind of restraint toward a defeated enemy that speaks, I think, rather better of this Navy's actual character than any of our official doctrine documents ever quite managed to articulate on their own. The board's formal commendation, delivered some weeks later in a ceremony considerably larger and more public than Iris had anticipated when she'd first imagined how her crew's ordeal might eventually conclude, cited the Last Word's survival and escape as one of the most significant demonstrations of sustained discipline and tactical improvisation in the Terran Navy's modern history, and recommended, alongside individual commendations for every surviving crew member, that the full account of the crew's 4 months of concealment and eventual escape be incorporated into standard officer training curriculum across the entire service. "You survived by refusing to accept that a bad report was the same thing as a finished story," Corwin told her privately, after the formal ceremony had concluded, the two of them sharing a quieter moment away from the considerable press attention the story had by then attracted across Terran media. "I don't think there's a lesson in this Navy's entire training curriculum more worth teaching the next generation of officers than that one, Iris. 61 people are alive today because you refuse to let anyone else's assumption about what your crew was still capable of become the final word on the matter." Karas-Vel's own fate within the Voranth Imperium's military hierarchy proved, in the months following the Ashcutter's capture, considerably more complicated than either he or Iris Quan had anticipated during their brief, strange partnership aboard the Last Word. His formal report of the encounter, submitted with a candor that surprised his own superiors, described in careful, unflinching detail exactly how thoroughly his boarding team's confident assumptions had been overturned, and recommended, in language that echoed, without his fully intending it to, the same caution Terran officers elsewhere in the galaxy had learned to extend toward this particular species after their own costly encounters with humanity's talent for holding capability in reserve. I do not believe the loss of the Ashcutter reflects any failure of tactical judgment on my part or on salvage Master Corvallis's, he wrote, in a report that would, within Voranth military intelligence circles, become required reading for every officer assigned to border patrol duty along contested Terran space. I believe it reflects a systemic underestimation of exactly what a Terran crew is capable of sustaining, both in terms of physical survival and tactical discipline, under conditions our own doctrine assumed would produce either death or surrender within weeks rather than months. I would recommend this Imperium's intelligence services conduct a considerably more thorough review of Terran psychological resilience before authorizing further salvage operations against any wreck this species' own forces have not personally confirmed as fully, permanently disabled. The Voranth Imperium's own military command, faced with a report that echoed considerably more troubling intelligence assessments already circulating through the wider galaxy regarding humanity's true capabilities, spared Karas-Vel the disciplinary consequences his career might otherwise have faced for losing an entire patrol vessel to a supposedly dead enemy, reassigning him instead, in a decision that struck him as carrying no small measure of irony, to a new advisory role focused specifically on revising Voranth salvage doctrine, to account for exactly the kind of deception his own encounter with the Last Word's crew had demonstrated was possible. He thought often, in the months that followed, of the particular moment Commander Quan had extended his own captured crew, the same consideration she might have shown her own people, and found himself, more than once during his new advisory work, offering younger Voranth officers a piece of advice he suspected few of his own government's official doctrine documents would ever think to include. The most dangerous thing about that crew was never their weapons or their tactics, however impressive both eventually proved, he told one such gathering, some months into his new posting. It was their refusal to become cruel, even at the moment they held every advantage a defeated enemy could offer them to justify it. I do not know what that says about the wider Terran species, beyond the fact that our own Imperium's assumptions about what constitutes weakness in an opponent clearly require considerably more careful examination than 4,000 years of prior doctrine ever thought necessary to conduct. Ravi Desmuk, whose meticulous planning had shaped both the ambush that captured Karas-Vel's boarding team and the subsequent seizure of the Ashcutter itself, found the months following the crew's return considerably harder to navigate than the 4 months of desperate survival that had preceded them. A difficulty he did not fully anticipate and found, at first, somewhat embarrassing to acknowledge even to himself. He attended, in the years that followed, nearly every reunion the surviving crew organized among themselves, gatherings that began, in the first year after their return, as somewhat tentative, careful affairs, everyone still working through their own private version of the same difficult adjustment, and gradually became, as the years accumulated, something closer to genuine celebration. 61 people bound together by an ordeal none of them would have wished on anyone, marking each year. The particular date, their 4 months of silence, had finally ended in the corridor, where Karis Vell's team first discovered they'd been wrong. I don't think any of us fully understood in the moment what we were actually building during those 4 months, Ravi told the gathered crew at their fifth such reunion, raising a glass in a toast that had become, by that point, something of a tradition among them. We thought we were just surviving, rationing food, running silent watches, doing whatever the next hour's crisis required of us. It wasn't until we were home, and safe, and finally had the distance to look back on it properly, that I understood we'd actually built something considerably more durable than mere survival. We built a crew that trusted each other completely, in circumstances that would have shattered trust in almost any other group of 61 people thrown together by chance rather than choice. I don't think that's a small thing to have built, whatever else those 4 months cost every one of us to build it. The adrenaline and focused, disciplined urgency that had carried him through the ordeal itself gave way, once the crew's safety was no longer in daily question, to a quieter, more complicated reckoning with exactly what 4 months of sustained vigilance had actually cost him. And he found himself, more than once in the weeks after the formal debriefing concluded, seeking out the Navy's counseling services with a candor he would not have extended to the request before Kelser Expanse ever happened. I kept waiting for it to feel like relief, he told the counselor assigned to his case, some 6 weeks after the crew's return. Getting home, I mean. Being safe again, being able to sleep a full watch without wondering if this was the hour our luck finally ran out. Instead, it mostly just feels like I don't know how to stop watching for the thing that isn't coming anymore. I don't know how to just be a person again, after 4 months of being nothing but a function the ship needed to survive. That's a considerably more common experience than you might expect among people who have sustained the kind of prolonged, high-stakes vigilance your crew maintained, the counselor told him. The discipline that kept all 61 of you alive doesn't simply switch off the moment the danger passes, Lieutenant Commander. It takes time, and it takes deliberate, patient work to teach your own mind that the vigilance has finally done its job and can finally be allowed to rest. I'd encourage you to be considerably more patient with yourself about that process than I suspect your own instincts are currently inclined to be. Iris Kwan, working through her own version of the same difficult adjustment in the months that followed, found herself returning often to a single, quiet realization that had first settled into place somewhere during the tense 11 days of the crew's journey home, and that she carried with her, in the years that followed, as the truest lesson of the entire ordeal, considerably truer, she thought, than the formal commendations and the training curriculum inclusion, and the wider Navy legend her crew's story had, almost against her own wishes, become across the following years. People ask me sometimes, what actually got us through those 4 months? She told a gathering of new Naval Academy graduates, some 3 years after the last word's return, addressing a training session Terran Naval Command had specifically requested she deliver as part of the crew's story's formal inclusion in officer curriculum. They expect me to talk about tactics, or discipline, or the particular engineering solutions that let us stretch our supplies as far as we did. All of that mattered. None of it was actually the thing that got us home. What got us home was 61 people who refused to let an enemy's confident assumption about what we'd already become, dead, finished, a closed chapter in someone else's after-action report, decide the actual shape of our own story. Every single one of us had 100 private moments across those 4 months where giving up would have been considerably easier than continuing to hold the discipline our survival actually required. None of us did. I don't think that's a lesson you can teach through tactics alone. I think it's a lesson about what a crew becomes when every single member of it decides, individually and together, that the story isn't over just because someone else has already written the ending. The TCS last word itself, towed back to Terran space some months after its crew's dramatic escape by a salvage operation, considerably more careful and considerably better informed than the one that had originally discovered it, underwent a full structural assessment that confirmed what Iris and her engineering staff had already suspected across 4 months of intimate, hard-won familiarity with every failing system aboard: that the ship's damage, while severe, had never been beyond eventual repair, and that the vessel which an entire enemy Imperium had confidently logged as an empty, lifeless wreck represented, in the considered judgment of Terran Naval Command's own engineering review, a genuinely remarkable feat of both original construction and desperate, improvised maintenance. Terran Naval Command elected, following that assessment, not to simply repair the last word for continued active service, but to preserve it instead as a permanent memorial and training vessel, its hull restored to functional condition, but its interior maintained in several key compartments, exactly as the crew had left it during their 4 months of concealment. The hidden camera rigs, the makeshift watch stations, the careful, deliberate arrangement of the mid-deck corridor that had funneled an overconfident boarding party into an ambush 61 desperate, disciplined sailors had spent months quietly preparing for. Iris Kwan attended the vessel's formal dedication ceremony some 2 years after her crew's return, standing once more in corridors she had once known only by touch and memory during 4 months of enforced darkness, now lit and restored and open to a steady stream of Naval Academy cadets who walked through the ship's preserved compartments as part of their own formal training, absorbing, in a way no textbook account could quite manage to convey, the physical reality of exactly what 61 people had endured and ultimately overcome within these same scarred bulkheads. "I used to think," she told the assembled cadets, delivering the dedication ceremony's closing remarks, "that the most important thing I ever did as this ship's commander was give the order that faked our death at Kelser Expanse. I've come to believe, across the years since, that the order itself mattered rather less than everything my crew chose to do with the 4 months that order actually bought us. Any competent commander might have thought to vent a decoy thermal signature and cut the ship's systems in a moment of desperate crisis. What made the difference in the end was 61 people who chose, every single day for 4 months, to keep standing watch over a ship the rest of the galaxy had already decided was empty, who understood, without ever needing it said aloud, that a warship is never truly dead so long as its crew remains awake enough to keep fighting for it. She looked around the restored corridor one final time before concluding, at the exact spot where Karis Vel's boarding team had once walked past hidden Terran sailors with such careless, unearned confidence, and found, in the quiet wait of the moment, the truest possible summary of everything the preceding years had taught her. They thought this warship was empty, she said. They were wrong, because the people who mattered most aboard it never once stopped believing there was still a story left to finish. I'd ask every one of you, whatever ship you eventually command, whatever crisis you eventually face, to remember that the same thing will always be true of the crew you're given to lead. A ship is only ever as dead as the people aboard it decide to let it become. Mine decided, for 4 long months in the dark, that ours still had considerably more fight left in her than anyone watching from the outside would ever have guessed. I'd encourage every one of you to make certain, whenever your own turn comes, that you decide exactly the same thing.